Hi everyone, Dr. Karma here. It is the summer of 2020, the first COVID summer, hopefully the last COVID summer, we'll see. But I am making a supplementary video to my handouts and lessons on the thesis statement because a lot of my students know what a thesis statement is and what it's supposed to do, but they're not that good at making really strong thesis statements that are going to lead to a good paper. So that's what we're talking about today. The essentials, of course, for a good thesis is that it's clear, and that means that your reader knows exactly what your paper was trying to accomplish. So, for example, if I have a student who says, you know, this way that we do something at college is broken, it's inefficient, and they talk in their paper about why it's broken, why it's inefficient, and then you say, okay, so this was an evaluation essay, and then I'll have students say, no, it was a proposal. I was proposing that we fix it. Okay, but you never said that. You never said anywhere in there that we fix it, and you didn't tell us how to fix it. If you're just evaluating something and saying, based on my evaluation, this is inefficient, that's not a proposal. So you have to make sure that your thesis and your paper are clear and that they're actually going to suit your purpose. I want you to have a narrow thesis. A lot of students think they're going to get a long paper if they have a super broad thesis. This is not actually how it works. I know it's counterintuitive, but you want to narrow down to have a good thesis. So let me give you an example of a very common broad thesis that I see, and that's all students should be learning second language. Okay, so all students. You mean from preschool all the way through grad school? And my students were always like, no, of course not. And I said, okay, but you said all students. If you say all students, you have to actually do all students. And then you are never going to be able to write that paper for me because that's a book. You need to narrow that down to we need to have in this kindergarten a second language program because that's going to be your paper for me. Talking about just how to do it in that one school is going to be a super long paper when you talk about the why and the how. All right. It needs to be unified. No 3-point thesis. You should have 1 point and then however many reasons that you actually have. If you have more than 2 reasons, don't list them. It gets weird. Like if I have 17 reasons for something, I should not put them all in my thesis statement. It needs to be arguable, and that means there needs to be other points of view that a reasonable person can hold. And I'm going to keep saying reasonable as we talk today because you can always find some crazy people. And I know you know this because you're seeing social media and you are seeing what's out there in the world. You might have seen that just this week, a man attacked a cashier. He stabbed her when she asked him to put on a mask. He fled the scene in a car and was shot by police because another person said, put on your mask. There are unreasonable people out there. Your thesis is for the reasonable person. There needs to be other sides. If all of the evidence is on your side, then this is not an argument. This is just informational. There's no debate. There has to be a debate between reasonable people for this to be arguable, and that's where most students get stuck. All right, defendable, meaning you do actually need some evidence for this, because some students go too far and they just throw out, a conspiracy theory or I think aliens are real. They have no evidence, but and so that doesn't lead to a good paper. I also want to believe in aliens. I'm on your side. I totally want to believe that, but we need evidence. All right, let's talk about what we want to avoid. We want to avoid statements that are illegal. Let me give you an example. I had a student about 20 years ago. This was his thesis. All parents should have to take their children to Christian Bible study. He said, Jewish parents and Muslim parents and atheist parents. And I'm like, you're going to force someone to take their child to a Christian place? And he goes, yes, because it's good for their soul. And I'm like, okay, but it's unconstitutional. It directly violates the Constitution. It violates every law. It violates what this country was founded on. This is the kind of rule that is for a theocracy, not a democracy at all. So you'd have to change us out of a democracy. into your Christian Sharia law. I put an asterisk there because you can argue something that's illegal if in your paper you talk about how to change that law. But his paper, he didn't want to talk about the Constitution. He was just like, I think this is what should happen. Well, no, it's unconstitutional. The end. You don't want to have a statement that is impractical. I've had many students want to use this as their statement. All UCD students should be required to do study abroad. There are people who are parents. There are people who care for other people. There are people who have jobs they can't leave. There are people definitely who can't afford it. DACA students cannot leave the country because they would never be able to get back into the country. We have students here now who are studying abroad here, and then you're saying that they would have to leave here and interrupt their study abroad to go do another study abroad. What are you talking about? You cannot make this a requirement that someone has to leave the country for any amount of time. It's impractical. It's not going to work unless you're going to do some magic in that paper making it practical. You don't want something that's impossible. This is my favorite example of an impossible thesis. UCD should stay on the quarter system, but the quarters should be as long as semesters. This is impossible once you do math. 4 quarters times 16 weeks equals 64 weeks. The year, though, is 52 weeks. So just like the first student would have to change the Constitution, this student would have to change the calendar. Like the whole understanding of time that we have. Notice, too, that 64 weeks does not even include finals week or breaks. Just straight school for 64 weeks of the year. Oh, that student was really embarrassed because she wrote the whole paper, never did the math. And yeah, that's a really easy one to blow out of the water. Okay. Let's talk about some weak thesis statements that have been used in my classes before, and I'm going to show you some revisions too that might work, and you'll notice that many of these revisions shift the topic entirely because they're just some ideas that are never going to work on their own. I've had students arguing recently that gay marriage should be legal in the US. Okay, but it is. And they'll say, well, some people don't think it should be. And I'm like, well, it doesn't matter whether they think it should be. It is. It's like saying, I don't think that building should be there. Well, it is. And it's not your building and it's not your land. Like, it doesn't matter. It's just not an argument. It is. Now, there are lots of things that you can argue about laws that affect the LGBTQA community, but this one just isn't going to be a good paper for you to write on. It's also gay marriage is a cliche topic in papers. There are so many other things to have an opinion on. So one of the things you could do is pick a kind of marriage that is not legal and talk about that. So you could talk about how polyamorous marriage should be legal in the United States. It's not. That's an argument that people have different opinions on. You could shift gears entirely and just get away from marriage being regulated by the state. So here I said people should be able to enter into legal property and custody arrangements, but marriage should no longer be regulated. Just have marriage be something else. And then we don't even have to talk about whether X marriage is legal or not. That's an argument that we can agree and disagree on and would make an interesting paper, both of those things. Women should be paid equally. A student just recently said that this was a strong thesis. And I'm like, who are you arguing against? Are there people in this country who don't think women should be paid equally? Yes, and they are bigots. They've had their whole lives to decide that women are people, and they've taken the opposite position that they're not. Your paper is not going to persuade them. It's also, just like in the first one, it's in the law that we're supposed to be paid equally. What you could argue about is that we need to finally ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, which we've never been able to do in this country for some weird ass reason. Or you could argue something like we should get rid of statutes of limitations on discriminatory pay cases, because right now there are those limitations. If you only find out a couple years afterward that you were paid half of what your male colleagues were paid, if you find that out after a couple years, it's too late. And that seems unfair to me. That is an argument that I can make. By the way, rape cases have statutes of limitations on them in many states, which means if a guy gets away with it, if he doesn't get caught, like the California Golden State Killer, they couldn't prosecute him on the rapes because he got caught so late. So if you just get away with raping a bunch of people for long enough, you get a get out of jail free card. What? Write that argument. There are so many things to write good arguments about, and I get worked up because I get just tons of papers on pot's cool, gay marriage, blah blah. They argue about other stuff. There's so much else. Okay. Other weak thesis statements. Americans should eat better. Yeah, who? Okay. Even those of us who are overweight agree with this. I know that I could eat better than I do. I don't eat badly, actually, but I could always eat better than I do. Not have that one cookie that week kind of thing. No one disagrees with this statement. And that's the trick. Whenever you say we should do something better, we should do more, people don't disagree with that. It's when you actually talk about what they should do. What's the specific thing? If you came to me and said, Karma, I think you should completely cut sugar out of your diet, well, that's something we have to discuss, because I'm not going to go, oh, okay. Like, whereas I will go, oh, okay, Americans should eat better. Yeah. Don't say we should do something better, we should make something more efficient. You have to say exactly what you want the change to be for it to be arguable. So, one of the things you could say is we should reinstate the Obama regulations on school lunches. People disagree about this, so that's an argument that you could have. Social media negatively impacts body image. Yes. Every single study shows this. There is no counter argument. Now, you might have someone who doesn't know the extent of it, but that's an informative paper. You're just informing them of these incontrovertible facts. I had a student who wanted to do this topic recently, and she realized this is not an argument. I don't have a counter argument. I don't know what to do. And so she really had to shift this. And so this is sort of close to what she came up with. California middle school health classes should include a unit on social media use. That's something we can disagree on. By the way, the reason that I had it here as California is because things about curriculum are usually set at the state and local level. And that's because of Amendment 10. And if you're looking at doing anything political at all, you have to go look at Amendment 10, which states that anything explicitly not mentioned in the Constitution is regulated by the states. And so that's where a lot of problems come in when you're talking about how to do stuff. Other weak thesis statements. I had a student who basically argued this: keeping up with the Kardashians should be banned because it encourages bad values and bad body image in young people. Should be banned? Who's going to ban it? The government can't. That's unconstitutional. That violates the First Amendment. It's the same thing as saying you have to go to church. It's that level of violation. The TV network isn't going to ban it because they're making money off of it. So they're not going to do that. And then other people are just like, who cares? Like, I have not watched the show. I don't really like reality TV, but if you want to watch it, I don't go ahead. I don't care. So she ended up with something sort of close to this. Concerned parents should write to those who advertise during Keeping Up with the Kardashians, because that is the only way to change it. This thesis still wasn't something that was going to really go anywhere, but at least it was more of an argument now. All right, let's talk about this. Because of COVID-19, Americans should wear masks. Yes, they should. There is no reasonable counter argument. I had a student who wanted to write about this last term, and he said, okay, but a lot of people don't. And I said, yes, but they're not reasonable. And he said, but the president doesn't. And I said, yes, that's what I just said. Those people aren't reasonable. The science is out there, the news is out there. They don't trust the science and they don't trust the news, and they're not going to trust your paper about the science, college student, sweet darling, if they don't trust the CDC. These are not reasonable people. Let's look at some of these people that you're arguing to. There's this Karen standing off against a doctor. She thinks her opinion about the freedom to not wear a mask is more important than his medical opinion and his life, quite frankly, that she's endangering by not wearing one. There's Florida Karen here, explaining that she won't wear a mask and she doesn't wear underwear, and she thinks that that's about the same thing. She's not going to be persuaded by your paper. And then there's this Karen who tried to shame this barista for enforcing his store's mask policy. And notice that she said there, next time I will wait for cops. Oh, oh. Those of you who are following this story know that Lennon from Starbucks got a bunch of money tipped to him from around the country. And now this Karen is arguing that she should get half of that. She is not a reasonable person. She will not be persuaded by your paper. Papers about wearing masks are informative. They're not argumentative. There isn't another reasonable side. Finally, let's talk about proposals. And that's because even sometimes when students have a fairly decent proposal, they don't develop it in a way that's actually argumentative. So here, let's look at something fairly recent. Because most students can do well in online courses if X and Y conditions are met. Those were really long conditions, so I'm not leaving them here. And because it allows for schedule flexibility, all UCD classes should be online in the future. Now, it's a clear proposal. It's not logical. And of course, the reason it's not logical is, it is more flexible. That doesn't mean all the classes should be that way. And also, most students can also do well in in-person classes. And so to say there should never be an online course since most people can do well, it's illogical to say the whole thing should shift based on a reason that applies to both. So let's put logic aside though, for the sake of this argument, and look at what has to happen. Because I had students argue this and they did not do it well at all. So you have to talk about the why, and there are studies. And again, those studies show that there are some students who can do really well in online courses if the courses are designed in a certain way and if they're this kind of student, kind of blah, 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 blah. Okay, there are those studies. Now, of course, those studies don't say that those online courses are better or that students do better in them. And so that's something that the students never grappled with. And part of that is because they did not look at counter argument in the right way. So let's think about the counter arguments to this, and there are many. First, there are classes that simply can't. For example, here at UC Davis, there's a class on how to slaughter animals, and in that class, you have to do it. Like, you kill that cow and you butcher it. This is not something you can do via Zoom from your bedroom. There are just classes that can't do it. That's an extreme example, but there are a lot of other classes that can't do it. More students, in my experience, drop out of classes that are this way, and massive online courses we've seen have very low pass rates and very high dropout rates. So this is problematic. You get a sort of loss of sense of community. There are problems with access. There are students right now who've had to go home for the pandemic and they don't have internet at home and they don't have a computer at home, and they are having to try to do writing classes and their other classes on a phone, having to use their data because they don't have internet. That's not sustainable. And these students' papers never talked about access. How are we going to do this for students with certain disabilities? How are we going to do this for our at-risk students who aren't economically advantaged? Are we going to make sure they have computers? They just ignored that, and you can't ignore the counter arguments. Let's think of some of the other ones. Cheating happens. It's going to be harder to catch in this way. If I never see you, if I never get to know you, how do I know it's you and not your brother who's taking this course? How are you going to make connections with us for your internships, for grad school, right? How are you going to do grad school and find your committee? When you're in grad school, you have to put together your committee. You have to go to your professors. You have to make those things. You have to talk to them. We don't come to you and say, hey, put me on as your third person for your dissertation. You have to do that. And thinking about doing that online is just terrifying. My son is actually starting grad school in the fall, and it's going to be online, and it's going to be something to watch. Zoom fatigue is a counter argument to all of your classes being online. Loss of revenue is a counter argument. By loss of revenue, what I mean is that in many situations, it's actually more expensive to do this online. Teachers are supposed to get paid more. I'm supposed to be getting paid more right now teaching this class online. I'm not, because the university is lying and saying I'm not teaching online, but I'm remote teaching. But okay. But anyway, there's that. But there's also that a lot of students, if the whole class is online and they're never going to meet their teacher and there isn't going to be a campus community, well, they're like, well, then why even go? I will just stay home, take a community college class or whatever it is that they do, or I'm going to go take classes at the University of Phoenix if it's cheaper. And so, you end up losing that. So it's not great for that. A lot of teachers also hate teaching online, so you'll lose some of them. Um, and quite frankly, a lot of students hate learning online. What was interesting to me is that my students who made this argument last term ignored what students wanted, because all of my students except one said they hated that our course was online and they wanted it to be in person. You can't ignore that. You can't just say, oh, well, it's more flexible, so let's do that. That was the one student who liked it being online. And the other student, like, well, you can do well, okay. But even that student said that he would have preferred that our class be in person. You have to talk about all of this stuff, but you still haven't talked completely about how. Most teachers aren't trained to do this. I'm trained now. I took a special course on how to do this, and so I do actually have certification to teach online, but the vast majority of my peers do not. Where's that training going to come from? Because remember these X and Y conditions, it's that courses are set up in a certain way and a teacher knows how to do something a certain way, and these students were sort of ignoring that we don't have a process in place to all of a sudden get all of our teachers up to speed on this. We don't even have a process in place, quite frankly, to make sure all teachers have what they need. One of the problems that I have been observing is that some of my peers don't have a computer that's strong enough at home with the capacity to do Zoom meetings. And so then how are they supposed to have Zoom check-ins with their students and office hours? The average pay for a lecture in the UC system is about $20,000, and that's with them paying rent in California. And so they don't have the money to upgrade them themselves, and they shouldn't because it's a work expense, but the university doesn't want to pay for that. And so there's all of this how. If you're writing a proposal, you cannot just talk about why something should happen. You have to find out how, and you have to ask questions. Like, you're not going to know about the teacher side of this without asking us, but that's going to have to be part of your research project. What are the barriers to my plan? Okay, almost done. I'm going to finish by simply talking about making a grown up argument. There are still people who their thesis statements tends to be kind of like a quick fix argument, which is a fallacy, instead of a grown up one. And so let me go over some of the more common ones. And that's we should fill in the blank instead of funding the military. And sometimes it's we should fund education. And sometimes we should make sure people have enough to live on if they've gotten fired during the pandemic. Just fill in the blank instead of funding the military. Okay. If you bring up in your thesis changing the military budget, you have to deal with that in your paper. You have to go through the military budget. You have to talk about what can be cut. Are there things can be cut? Yes, there are certain types of planes, for example, that we don't really even use anymore. But do you want to do that? No, you're just saying instead of the military, and it's a ad populum quick fix. It's those two things combined. Also, you're going to lose everybody who doesn't want to touch the military budget. And that's not what you want to do with your argument. You want to be able to convince not just the people who already agree with you. Say we're talking about funding education, then just say we need to fund education. And there's all of these different ways to talk about how, but you don't want to necessarily say that has to be combined always with cutting the military budget because you'll lose those people. A couple of people recently have said things like frontline workers shouldn't be making so little when all those people on unemployment are making so much. Okay, all those people on unemployment are not making so much. Settle down. B, what the hell are you doing by linking these two things together? There isn't some pot of money where people who've been fired during the pandemic are taking the money that would go to paying these frontline workers more. That's not what's happening. People on unemployment need to be taken care of. Frontline workers need to be taken care of. These are not things that need to be set in opposition to each other. I don't know why I've just had a couple students recently who want to demonize people who've been fired. Most people on unemployment want to be employed. Frontline workers, should they be making more? Absolutely. Are you in your paper going to research how unemployment payments work? Are you going to be able in your paper to show a connection between these two things? Because if this is your thesis, you have to be able to show that connection and show that somehow unemployed people are living a life of luxury and that money could be funneled, and you're not going to be able to do it. Leave other people out of it. Talk about these people that need to be making more money, why and how. Some people will say things like, we shouldn't even be talking about whatever you want to talk about when the thing I want to talk about is happening. And of course, this is ridiculous because it's not like the human brain can only handle one thing at a time. We can, for example, be concerned about the COVID epidemic at the same time that we're concerned with the epidemic of unarmed people of color being more likely to be shot by police. We don't have to say, let's put all of our energy onto one thing or the other. And this is just a really immature way of telling someone else to shut up and only worry about your thing. And that would be unfair if they did it to you too. I don't have to fix 100% of your problem before I'm allowed to try to fix 10% of my own. Or, by my problem, I mean the thing that I might be protesting in that moment. And this goes along with a common argument that people make, which is, something doesn't fix all of the problems, so why bother? Sometimes you see this, like, if we have a sort of tax on companies that are big polluters, well, that doesn't fix global warming, so why even bother? And you're like, wait, what? Or, those unreasonable people who are saying, well, a mask can't protect you from getting it at all. It only protects you mostly from getting it. So why even wear a mask? And it's like, well, when I get in the car, putting on my seatbelt will save me in certain kinds of accidents, but not all of them. But, I'm still going to put on the seatbelt. And like, I keep my front door locked. Someone could still break in, but I'm not going to keep the door unlocked because it doesn't provide me 100% safety. So, this is I'm wanting you to stay away from these sort of childish arguments that people make. Let's go back to the basics as we end right now. Your thesis needs to be arguable, meaning debatable, needs to be defendable. I'm here as you're creating your thesis for your papers to talk about your ideas. Always feel free to shoot me an email and say, hey, I'm thinking about this. Do you think that it will work? And I will get back to you. Okay, that's been this COVID-19 video about how to make a strong thesis. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.